Hello, everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of the ReNouned podcast. We're your co-hosts, Alison Hager
and Mark Schulz.
For anyone joining us for the first time, ReNouned is a podcast for the curious. We dust off the commonplace to look for new relevance as we challenge ourselves to do critical thinking about the objects that surround us, how they echo humanity's past, reflect the present, or foreshadow the future. So with that, Mark, do you want to remind everyone what this episode's noun is?
Sure. The noun is map, M-A-P, map.
Short and sweet.
But rich, complicated.
I will say
sort of.
Rich is the exact word I would use. I mentioned this before we turned on the recording. My brain hurts this week, actually. So this should be interesting. So should we just jump right in and roll our die?
Let's do it.
So.
Ooh.
What'd you get? 3.
Ooh,
so it is up to you.
All right. So my just the hits. If you can give me 15 seconds, let me know.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3, go.
Maps have been an essential tool throughout history for humans to document and understand not only the world, but ourselves. And in that lies the power and perhaps the danger of drawing borders.
Nice. You have 3.5 seconds left, basically.
Great.
Well done. I think I'm going to struggle with mine this week, so I may speak a little quickly.
Okay.
Let me know when I'm good to go.
Absolutely. 3, 2, 1. Hit it.
With his marine clocks, John Harrison tested the waters of space-time. He succeeded against all odds in using the fourth, temporal dimension to link points on the three-dimensional globe. He wrested the world's whereabouts from the stars and locked the secret in a pocket watch.
Okay. You only cut off pocket watch.
I think I just...
You were so good.
Oh,
yeah. I could see why your brain's hurting. Mine's hurting from your just the hits. This is interesting. I'm not sure I even followed what you just said. No. No, I think it's going to be complicated. Okay, yeah, I won't make you do it again. But yeah, if I was an audience member, I'd be like, I'm going to listen to that again because what? And that's not a judgment on how you wrote it. I just think it's a complex.
No, absolutely. And it was a quote. It was actually a quote. I didn't even write that, but I learned a lot. I learned a lot.
Nice. I have a feeling that mine's going to be like the survey class on like some basics, and then yours is going to like really go there. So that's going to be a good 1-2 punch for all our listeners today. I think maybe.
I think there's some really uplifting stuff in mine as well. So it's not just all like brain hurty stuff. In fact, I'm kind of dumbing it down. So okay, Mark. Hit it right. Into the deep.
Into the deep. And so, of course, audience, you know me by now. Before the rabbit hole, I like to do my little, etymology corner or something. So here's a definition and some etymology. So basically, map comes to us from way back from Latin mappa, M-A-P-P-A. Pretty straightforward. And that actually means cloth. So then that over time became Mappa Mundi, Mundi being world. So it basically meant a world cloth was an expression for basically maps that were of the known space and world at the time. So that moved into French later, map monde, actually all one word, M-A-P-P-E, instead of mappa, map with an E, and then monde, of course, anyone who knows some French, that is the word for world in French. So mundi would have been in the Latin, monde in the French. That then moved into Old English as map monde. If I'm saying that right, M-A-P-E, they dropped one of the P's, and then M-O-U-N-D-E. And that was also one word. So over time, we shorten map monde, I guess, into map. We dropped the monde, the world part off of it, and we are left, with map. So that I think in itself is interesting, but also you can therefore also think of the similarity with the word napkin, because technically mappa might mean cloth or a napkin, and where that kind of comes from is napkin you can break into two pieces, nap and then kin. So nap, of course, very similar to map, and kin actually is a diminutive ending, right? Like a cute little ending for in English that therefore took nap and made it cute and small. So little cloth. So when we use a napkin, you're using a little cloth. You can think of munchkin, the expression daddykins, like things like that. Like we add.
I know, but now I'm thinking
things.
mapkin, like a little baby map, and I'm loving it.
Yeah, totally. I'm surprised we don't have like napkin actually. So that is related. And then a little bit of another side note. I went down some smaller rabbit holes here. If kin is a diminutive suffix in English, there is a French diminutive eron, E-R-O-N, which took mappa through to naperon. Naperon became an English word apron, apron. So therefore, it's kind of like, and I can't verify this, but that would almost mean like a little tablecloth that you would wear, actually, right? Instead of on the table, it's on you. So I thought that was like a cute way to tie together map and napkin and apron and all these things that were using a mix of cloth, but then how cute and small it was or in size, etc.
Mark, you're all over the map with your etymology today.
Oh, boom. I love it. And then one other thing, right? If as I was going through this, I actually came back and did some etymology a last little bit after I had done a lot of my research. If you're curious where cartography comes from, right? If you're thinking map and then you're like, well, cartography is actually the more scientific sort of map drawing and map making. If you were to then think of the etymology, someone who might not have done some of the research would think, well, how are we cartography? How are we the graphy? Might make sense, right? It's the drawing of something, but carts. Why are we drawing wagons? Like it would be like, where is that coming from? So cart for us is actually related to the French carte, C-A-R-T-E, which actually means several things. It means map. It means card. It means ticket. It means menu. It's basically a sheet of paper. And so carte became card. Instead of a T, became a D in English. And that is largely unexplained, apparently. In some of my research on this, linguists don't know why that happened, but they're both stop plosives. They're one's just unvoiced and one's voiced. So I think that kind of makes sense that English swapped it out at one point. But for some reason, for map making, we maintained the T for cartography and didn't switch it to a D. Otherwise, we could have ended up with cardography, really, but maybe because the T goes into the ography a little bit better, we have cartography instead of cardography. Totally a rabbit hole, but yeah, it was kind of fun to nerd out with that. So there's a little background on the words that we're talking about and dealing with today. All right, transitioning into trivia. Trivia 1. Alison will answer, but audience, please give a thought to what you think your answers are. What ancient civilization is credited with creating the first known maps? Is it A, Mesopotamians, B, Egyptians, C, the Greeks, or D, the Romans?
Mesopotamians.
You are correct. It is Mesopotamians. And I'm actually, usually I give a little bit of the context and explanation, but part of my rabbit hole will actually go there. So let's just dive in a little bit. So maps have been an essential part of human civilization since ancient times, for example, Mesopotamia, and that early evidence of the first known map being created by the Babylonians, but also the Egyptians and Greek, but Babylonians in Mesopotamia sort of beat out the Egyptians and the Greeks by a little bit of time. So these maps were very simple representations of the world around them and often were used for religious or cultural purposes. So over time, maps have been used in sort of three main areas. One, to understand geography. Two, to explore and navigate the world. And three, to create boundaries. Now, as I started to go through this research, if you're anything like me, and I'm not assuming that everybody is or isn't, but I always sort of lumped those three things together, I think, in sort of one big geographical. It's a map. I don't know, but the more that those three things, I'm going to give some examples of how we've used maps in each of those. I do think you can draw a bit more of a delineation between a border between the three, right? Geographical and understanding what the geography, the physical nature of things are, but then how to use the map to explore and navigate the world, more of a functional use of moving yourself in that space. And then three, creating boundaries and what that can mean sort of geopolitically and socially, unfortunately, and sometimes fortunately.
This is great because the beginning of my rabbit hole was some of the stuff, which is great because now I don't have to do it. But one thing on I believe that map is called the Imago Mundi, right? Image of the world, the Babylonian map. We call it the Babylonian Map of the world, but its original name was the Imago Mundi.
That I did not have. So great. Excellent. I'm glad you have it.
But you mentioned it's on a stone, like on a stone tablet. You can see it in the British Museum in London, but it also has some text on it carved into it in cuneiform, which I thought was a nice callback to our writing episode. So
no, that is
that in there.
That's perfect because I'm going to discuss very briefly what some of that writing talks about, but not deeply.
Oh, cool.
Not deeply at all. No, excellent. And I'm glad that you have a more formal and probably more well-known name for it. My research just said a clay tablet, like you said, and it's surrounded by what they called the Bitter River.
Yes, or salt, or those, salt something. Yeah, it's really interesting the way they.
Right, it's interesting that the ocean and that word, and I won't get into that. Audience, I'll spare you that. But right, they just considered it a very all-encompassing river. Still, they were thinking in terms of that and why was it bitter versus
and I think the regions outside. Go ahead. I don't want to take away from anything.
No. You, please jump in with
it just was with your bitter river piece, because I guess it's Babylonia's in the middle, Babylon's in the middle, of course, because these are the people doing it, and then there's like 8 regions shown around them, like kind of the extent of the world. But they called them islands. It's just interesting, right? Because they knew, like, it could have been metaphorical. It could have been like they thought they were islands because the river was anyway. It's all fascinating. So tell us more.
No, absolutely. Okay, so this map that we're talking about, everyone, I'm going to give some examples. So this would be for me an understanding geography. One of the first of 3 uses of maps that we've used. So to understand geography, the first recorded map is this depiction Alison and I have been talking about, Babylonian, dating from about 600 BCE from Mesopotamia, and as we've been saying, it's a clay tablet, basically showing the world as a disc surrounded by this bitter river. And it had Babylon marked as a rectangle at the end of the Euphrates River that was running through this map. So a couple things that are talked about, I believe, in the cuneiform that Alison mentioned, et cetera, are one is the movement of the sun, described as rising in the east, crossing the heavens, and then setting in the west, but actually kind of going under into the underworld. I think the way that it's described right there, picturing again a flat earth, and it's going, a certain way east to west, and then underneath, and then back up. So into the underworld and then back, topside, so to speak. The tablet features, yes, as Alison mentioned, 8 outlying regions with a note to the distance to each, which I didn't look up exactly what it is. I believe that it's pronounced Beru, Beru, being 6 or 7 Beru. So I don't know what that is, but it was certainly a measure of some kind of distance. And the text on the tablet describes some of the inhabitants of the areas beyond the earth on these islands that Alison mentioned, whether divine, human, animal, or monstrous. References to important figures in Mesopotamian myth and history. I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but Ut, and then I believe it's Napashtim, Napishtim, Napashtim, which is a Noah figure. And I'm going to pause there just as a little aside. Anyone who's a regular listener knows that I love to critique organized religion in many ways. And I think there are many, certainly in the United States, that still, unfortunately, take the writing in the Christian Bible as literal truth versus a collection of mythologies and stories that might give some guidance in certain ways, et cetera, et cetera. So the Noah and the Ark story, it was news to me, but again, not a surprise to me, that this actually far predated the story of the flood from the Bible, and it came out in my research that many cultures around the world have had flood mythologies.
Yeah.
It may or may not tie to climate change after the melting of the last ice age and a lot of water. So therefore, around the world there were these obviously a lot of water, therefore a lot of flood mythologies and what that meant as the society struggled with it. So that was a story of a character named Napishtim, who was tasked by the god Enki, I believe, to basically build an ark and do everything that we know of from the Christian story of Noah and the ark. I digress, but a lot of things are borrowed. A lot of things are not unique to the Bible. So also others are Sargon and Nurdagan, or Nurdagan, perhaps. They were famous rulers of the time, and suggest that they may have all been imagined as inhabiting these regions on the tablet. They were these figures that were probably out there along with these other humans and animals or monstrous beings in these, 8 areas around the outside. So that's one example of one of the first known pieces, and using it to understand some geography. But I think not just geography, it's probably understanding sort of the metaphysical and religious as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which I think you hit on. You said it was such a rich topic, and I was like, yes, my brain hurts. And it is like that too. Like you're just talking about one map, and you've already been talking about like they used it to like geolocate their own place on the known world. They also then like were calculating distances and thinking about astronomy. And how that tied in. And then there was also this huge layer of mythology, not only about the sun going down, right, to wherever it goes, the underworld, and coming back up, but also the mythology around some of those islands and what they perceive to happen there. So right away, you just go down, you have so many layers, it's really hard to parse them.
Yeah. Yeah. And for me, I hadn't thought of it until you just mentioned that had they tried to map stars and planets, we're basically back where we started with our orbit conversation.
Yes.
From another civilization that was taking it and trying to represent that and how it started the whole.
Yeah.
In
fact, I'm going to talk a little bit about our old friend Galileo when we get to my
amazing.
part. So
Excellent.
another callback.
I want to hold that up because I love me some Galileo. Okay. So the second use of maps, exploring and navigating the world. So I wanted to find, and educate myself on an example of that. And it's funny, when I looked through some of the classic expeditions, naval expeditions, I wanted to force myself not to focus on one of the ones that I think I would have covered in our very Western focused education.
Cool.
So Magellan and the others, I was like, something else. So I learned about a gentleman named Zheng Huan. I believe it's Zheng, but that's pronounced Zheng, and He is the last name, and that is Huan. And he was a Chinese explorer and admiral in the early 15th century. So he led, he actually went a little bit into his background. He was a Muslim of Muslim descent within the Yunnan province, I believe. So over time, though, as that was conquered and brought into, I believe, the Ming dynasty in China, he actually was a eunuch and then brought in to serve as an admiral and kind of grew up in the naval system, but became one of their most famous naval explorers. So he played a significant role in expanding China's trade networks and diplomatic relationships with other countries. So he introduced new shipbuilding and navigation technologies to China. His legacy has been continued and celebrated in China and beyond from that. His expeditions expanded China's trade networks, advancements in, as I mentioned, a lot of the technologies, and explored and mapped new areas beyond China, sort of expanding their overall knowledge of the world. He actually went to India on 100 or 200 years before the Portuguese came around Africa to India. So he came the other way and was there first, basically, which I think was kind of interesting. And so his legacy also has inspired a lot of later explorers and adventurers from China and that area. So I thought that was cool in terms of, somebody who was active and a lot of the maps, I didn't go into specifically the maps he was using. I wanted to cover some other things we'll get to in a second, but yeah, he really furthered a lot of the known world for China and therefore maps and representations of that.
Very cool. And I love that you did, the way you prefaced it, that, all of us here in the US in social studies, I don't know if it's still called that, right? We did. Totally, we learned about Christopher Columbus and Magellan and Captain Cook and all these folks. So that is our grounding, right? When we learn about the explorers and kind of early maps and all that stuff. So I love that you went to a culture that we unfortunately weren't as educated about when we were younger. Well done.
Yeah, I think, and not to risk. I always think on our podcast, it's one thing I love about our show is I feel like when I talk about things that I'm learning, I feel a little bit vulnerable to show things that I don't know. Right. Because I think there'll be a lot of people be like, how does Mark not know that?
Stop it.
And honestly, I'm sure there'll be things you're like, what? But for me, to your point, Alison, I think it would do a lot of good for young Americans growing up to not only be exposed to the overall story that I just mentioned, but even the details, because when I hooked in to say, oh, wait a minute, he's a Muslim Chinese.
Yeah.
It's just, and I know that there are many of them, I would assume, but it's not what you picture when you read our news and we are conditioned to think of China a certain way, especially in current communist China. You know what I mean? It's very different than reading about the story and realizing the mix of cultures from that whole era. I just think it's, yeah.
Well, this is part of the reason we do this, right? It's like we're learning and we're going down one avenue to learn more about one particular noun, find a threadway, and then we end up learning all this other amazing stuff.
Exactly. Okay.
Makes us better.
So moving to trivia question number 2.
Uh-oh.
What is the name of the system used by the United States to identify and locate points on the Earth's surface? Is it A, the Geographic Information System, GIS? Is it B, the Universal Transverse Mercator, UTM? Is it C, Global Positioning Systems, GPS? Or is it D, Latitude and Longitude System?
Well, I see. Okay. Because honestly,
this is tricky a little bit because
it could honestly be any of the. So the beginning of the question was the official system.
What is the name of the system used by the United States to identify and locate points on the Earth's surface?
I mean, it's gonna have. I'm gonna have to go with what was the second? Not latitude and longitude, which I'm going to be talking a lot about. Not GPS, the Mercator one, Universal
Transverse Mercator, UTM. You're going to be bad. It is D, latitude and longitude, but I believe the Universal Transverse Mercator probably was established by the latitude longitude?
Yes, which I am going to be talking about.
Right,
and this is why it was killing me, because latitude and longitude isn't just used by the US. Latitude and longitude is the gold standard. It is what allowed us to locate places on Earth.
Right.
I'm
and
mad
that might
now.
be that. I know you're going to be mad. That is a tricky way to ask it because it is not just the United States. It is used by the United States, but it's used by a lot of places.
Exactly. But that's why I'm like, it can't just be latitude, longitude. It has to be one of the steps that came later, which Mercator made huge improvements to the grids, which I will go into. Okay, I'm going to shut up.
Super glad you're going there because I did not. And I saw, of course, hints of it. Yay. No, I'm excited about yours. Okay. So the concept of latitude was developed by the ancient Greeks, while the concept of longitude was developed by Greeks, Romans, and Chinese, actually. All had similar approaches to it. So over time, various methods were developed to determine longitude, but they were not widely adopted until the invention of more accurate timekeeping devices in the 18th century. And then in the 19th century, a modern system was used using decimal degrees, what we kind of know now for latitude and longitude, and it was standardized. That's as deep as I went, but it sounds like you're going there.
No, it's perfect. That is like actually the perfect layup for what I'm going to be talking about.
Good. Okay. No, this is, I think it's coming true what I thought. I'm going to do like the survey class and then you're going to like go deeper. Okay. I'm doing 101. You're doing 102. Let's say that. 201. I don't know. I don't remember college. It was a million years ago. No, you have a 101 class, and then your next year you take a 201 class, right?
Yes, correct.
Okay. All right. And then the last thing, creating boundaries. So on this one, you take this geopolitical, and we take a bit of it's definitely a darker sort of angle to a degree. Depends on how you look at it, I guess. So the Treaty of Versailles that ended World War I dissolved the German, Austro-Hungarian, and Ottoman empires and created new nation states in their place. I know that is a broad thing that is sort of well known, but if we're thinking really specifically in remaking maps and what that can do politically, when instead of you're describing something that is physically out there, you are forcing territories to change between nations and management of nations and power struggles and things like that. For example, it redrew the map of Europe and reduced the size of Germany as a penalty, basically, for the war. Therefore, Germany lost territory to France and to Poland. New political boundaries were established. The treaty was intended to prevent Germany really from regaining its pre-war strength and to basically weaken its influence. So right here, you see maps wielded in a way that is not reactive to things that pre-exist out in the world, but you can look at it as a real proactive tool, kind of a weaponized way of affecting people. So the treaty also established new borders in Eastern Europe, creating new states at the time, such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The treaty's creation of new political boundaries between nations helped shape the geopolitical landscape of the 20th century and led to many of the conflicts and tensions that followed thereafter. And that, again, in my survey class, I don't go deeper. That is a massive topic, of course, that has, and that was World War I. If you talk about World War II, you can really go there with everything from Israel to a lot of other very deep and trigger button topics for a lot of people.
For sure.
All right. So then I believe this is my last topic. Everyone will be happy to hear. I go a bit more into the modern era and some technology here. So in the modern era, maps have become even more sophisticated with the use of technology such as GPS and satellite imagery. Maps are now created using a geographic information systems, GIS, and are used for a wide range of purposes, including urban planning, disaster response, and scientific research. So I just want to touch on a bit of a difference. I mentioned two things there. GPS, which I think we're all probably familiar with because you know that your phone and Google Maps and so on is using GPS systems basically every day for billions of people. So GPS, global positioning. GIS, and if you missed it in what I just said, is geographic information systems. So just to compare and contrast those two things briefly. GPS, when you open Apple Maps or Google Maps and using the directions button and you're saying phone, yes, you share my location, etc. What that is doing when you share your location. It's a satellite-based navigation system that determines the user, right? If you're out there on the street looking for Burger King, I don't know, it's the first thing I thought of, must be hungry. And the user's precise location, you're looking for your location on the Earth's surface. It uses a process called trilateration. Focus on the three there in a second. It uses the device's received signals from three nearby tower locations, which includes data in this signal, right? Your phone is receiving three signals from three different directions, and that signal includes data on the tower's distance to the device. So using those three distances, again, the distances to each of those towers from the device, those distances are used as radii of circles, three circles from the tower. And then the device, the GPS system, either the device itself or the program, the platform that it's running, it uses mathematical equations to find the device's X and Y value. So picture yourself, if you're standing on the street, if you're on a grid system, just picture, right, the grid's going out to your right and left and up and down behind you. You want to find the X and Y on this map, right, this grid. It's using mathematical equations that find where those radii overlap, right? Where the lines of these three circles would all come together to pinpoint where you are. Now, why do you need three and not two, if you're wondering? Why? Trilateral, not bilateral. If you had two circles, picture, if you're everyone's familiar with a Venn diagram, I know that's three, but take one of them out of there, just two circles that are overlapping. You'll know that basically up top and down below, you'll have two intersections. So if you only have two, say two towers, we were only sending a signal to your phone, you could be in one of two places, right? And that's not really going to be helpful. It's not going to be super accurate. So you need a third tower, a third triangle to really pinpoint you specifically. Now, modern GPS systems, as they get better and better, are starting to move to what's called multilateral instead of trilateral. So you have more than three towers. You've got 4, 5, 6 more. And that is just using the same approach, the same where do all these circles with their radii, overlap to find you. And it is more and more specific to where you are. So that's GPS. GIS, on the other hand, right? That is more of an overall system for managing, analyzing, and visualizing geospatial data. Think of that as more of a massive database that's taking in a lot of data of different types and how you're using it to basically query it, to answer what you need from the GIS system to come up with a solution to whatever information you're trying to get at. Where GPS might provide location data into a GIS system, right? It might be a quote unquote a slave, it's not a PC term now, but like in a system where something is a servant to something larger, right? Its purpose would be to send data into a larger GIS platform and system to incorporate it into this geospatial database. GPS can be used to collect location data and then import it into the system to create maps, et cetera, et cetera. So that basically is happening when you are seeing, for example, on Google Maps, you're not just getting this plain XY grid of where you are, which means nothing to you. You're basically seeing where you're standing on a street. And that street could have overlays of everything from satellite imagery to, I don't know, probably radar, weather, whatever you want on these things. And all
they use it in wildlife management. Like they do, well, of course they do topography, and then they also do like types of ground cover, types of flora, like endless layers that you, like you're saying, that you have this like layered database that you can dive in, which gets really interesting.
And all of that is the GIS part of it's the broader right combination of all the data that's putting together. So together, GPS and GIS can be used to create powerful geospatial solutions. Everything Alison perfectly just talked about. I mean, that's it. I think my last note here was where you are on a map visually, not just the coordinates, which we talked about. Right. So to end my section with one last trivia question.
Oh, thought I was free and clear.
Always three.
I'm still angry about the last one.
What new technology is being developed that may revolutionize, the way we create maps, and involves using lasers to create detailed 3D representations of the Earth's surface? Is it A, quantum computing, B, augmented reality, C, LiDAR, D, neural networks?
I don't know. LiDAR.
It is LiDAR.
Yep. I mean, just because L laser, and I knew it wasn't. Yeah,
neural networks. That's totally it. So LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging. So the LI is light detection and ranging. As opposed
not raging. It's not
raging. As opposed to radar. Everyone knows what radar is, but we may have forgotten over time what those words actually stand for. So if LiDAR stands for light detection and ranging, radar is radio detection.
Exactly. I wanted to get something right.
That's it. Radio detection and ranging. So you can think of LiDAR as an upgrade to, instead of using radio waves, you're now using laser and light data and being very, very highly accurate to my notes here, right? Remote sensing technology is used to create these really highly accurate 3D maps. So LiDAR works by sending out pulses of laser light. They bounce off objects from quite a distance and return to a sensor. So this is usually a plane or a drone or some other airborne machine or device that is flying over location. So Alison mentioned in her example of maps using topography, or it could be anything. It could be a plantation or like tree coverage or something like that. So by measuring the time it takes for the laser to return to the sensor and analyzing the intensity of the returned signal, probably everything from like light frequencies and everything else, I'm assuming, LiDAR can create really, really accurate maps. So LiDAR is used in a variety of applications, mapping terrain, monitoring changes in the environment, and creating detailed 3D models of buildings and other structures. So as you start to see Google Maps, for example, get pretty accurate, I think a bit more accurate with things in terms of building structures, that's probably LiDAR as well. All right.
Very cool. I loved it. This worked out so well. Like you said, like this was such a great survey. And I love that you touched on so many facets of the map world. So I will, as Mark said, take it to a much more narrow place. He doesn't know, except for what I've told him that all of you have heard what I'm going to talk about. But you also mentioned a lot that allows me to cut off the beginning of my going into the deep.
I apologize,
which is,
but maybe
no, don't. It's perfect. It's fantastic. So I will skip ahead here. So Mark talked about all these uses for maps. And of course, the very first one was just like understanding where we were on the earth and how to get from maybe where we were to a point we wanted to go to. And if you think about the Imago Mundi, that's they were showing the world as they knew it and showing distances if I wanted to go to this region or that region. So the most basic kind of map, need. So as map making developed, as humans kind of understanding of the extent of the world changed, things had to develop with that. And so to that end, and Mark, you probably read about a lot of this stuff and just didn't have time to fit it all in your survey research here. But in 3 BCE, there was a Greek writer, geographer, astronomer, of course, named Eratosthenes. Say that slowly because I have to look at it really long time to get it right in my head. He made maps. He made the first maps that we're aware of, at least, with irregularly spaced grid lines. These are called parallels and meridians. And the parallels are the latitudes and the meridians are the longitudes. So Mark mentioned this. This is the standard system for being able to precisely pinpoint a spot on Earth. Most of you know this. I'm going to say this because reading about latitude and longitude and trying to understand it almost broke my brain. So I've always understood, of course, generally what they are, but I didn't really understand the calculations required, and it hurts. So just to frame this in its most basic sense, latitude is the distance north or south on the globe from a reference line, and that reference line needs to run perpendicular to Earth's axis. Longitude runs the other way, right? It runs from pole to pole, and together they create this grid system, theoretically using a global standard. So in about 5 centuries later, Ptolemy, who was an Egyptian astronomer of Greek descent, he built on Eratosthenes' work, and he created a map of the world as it was then known to the Roman Empire. And he modified the grid system. He used curved lines of latitude, right? So he did that because he wanted to reduce distortions. Because as we all know, it's a curved Earth. It's a flat piece of paper. There are always distortions in maps. That could be a whole other episode talking about the different maps and how they skew the representation of things on Earth. But
see Orbit, episode 1.
So he tried to account for this by doing curved latitude lines. And he also used the equator, right? We all know about the equator, but it's an imaginary line. It's just an imaginary line on Earth, equidistant between the poles, right? Equidistant from each pole as a reference. So for the meridians or the longitude to create a standard, he used the Fortunate Islands as the reference point. We know them more commonly as the Canary Islands. So that point in history, that was the westernmost known point of the world. So he went as far west as he could know and said, all right, let's just say this is our starting point that we'll calculate everything from. So helpful as all of this was in terms of now the world's growing, people want to understand how to very specifically locate points on Earth. It worked much better on land. Sea navigation was still incredibly problematic. And Mark talked about that Chinese explorer. I was thinking when I started thinking about sea exploration about like Polynesian sailors who, before anything existed, right, navigated miraculously hundreds of miles between islands, just using the stars alone. Anyway, incredibly difficult. You don't have landmarks on the open ocean, right? So you don't have that kind of cue to help you. So sailors needed another way to accurately determine their location. And as I mentioned, they would calculate location using celestial bodies. This allowed them to figure out their latitude relatively easily. I laugh when I say easily because like they could do it in their sleep. And I feel like I want to go to take a sailing course just to like be forced to learn how to like, you have to measure the angle of the sun or another celestial body to the surface of the earth, then extrapolate from that. And it's just, it
using
hurts.
a sextant, I think, right?
Yeah, correct. There used to just be a staff and then it upgraded to a sextant. Yeah. All sorts of developments there. But okay, so relatively easily they could figure out latitude, but longitude was another problem, just a much thornier problem. So as far back as the 1300 Common Era, sailors and map makers were, attempting to solve this navigation problem. And they used what are called rum lines. I don't know if any of your research talked about rum lines, Mark. RHUMB.
I know.
Don't make a pirate joke.
I'm just totally gonna be like, why is the rum gone? Yeah.
So rum lines. So you have these parallels, our latitudes and our longitudes. And the rum lines are lines on the map that are diagonals. So the diagonal that will cross all the meridians at the same angle. And using the same angle, it helps with navigation. But because of the Earth's curvature, these had to be constantly recalculated as the ship was in motion because the Earth is spinning and it's curved and the boat is moving. So your navigator would need to be just constantly calculating to provide accurate headings. If you ask me how, I
was being a language dork, and I'm wondering if rhombus and rum lines, because a rhombus is square with like a diamond. Ends.
Yeah, no, I bet you're right.
Something there is related, but we'll see. Anyway.
That's interesting. Well, I will look that up because I hadn't even thought of that. Okay, so they're using this, but it's exhausting and it's really hard, and they screw it up all the time. So this is a big problem. So by 1569, Gerardus Mercator, Mark mentioned the Mercator system.
I'm so glad you did this because I didn't. Yeah, cool. That makes sense.
He was a Flemish cartographer and geographer, and he created the first sailing map of the world. And he used straight longitude and latitude lines. So he took this grid developed by Eratosthenes, and then Ptolemy had updated by making them curved. Well, he went, by the way, Eratosthenes' lines were irregular, right? They weren't evenly spaced. So they were irregular and straight. So it wasn't, as helpful, but he did understand you need a grid. Ptolemy said, okay, let's curve these. Let's evenly space them. That makes much more sense. And the Mercator says, I'm going to make these straight. So there are consistent right angles, which helps with the calculations. And this meant a constant bearing was kind of easier to suss out. So within 50 years or so of Mercator developing this map, mathematicians had worked out the formulas required that sailors required to use Mercator's grid. And thus it's called actually Wright's Mercator grid, became the standard for sea navigation. Great. They're starting to solve this problem. However, it's still incredibly difficult, near impossible, even for the best, sailors. Why? Because latitude is fixed in nature. So I think, as I mentioned earlier, it can be pretty easily, determined by measuring the angle of the sun to the Earth's surface where you are, or at night, you could use the North Star in the Northern Hemisphere or the Southern Cross in the Southern Hemisphere. But longitude has no natural point of reference. So first you need a standard prime meridian, prime longitude. And so in the early days, map makers, many used Ptolemy's original Canary Island reference, but other map makers just put it wherever they wanted. It was really a political thing. Jerusalem, St. Petersburg, Rome, hey, we're the center of the earth, put it here. Well, that's not a standard that, navigators and sailors worldwide can use. It actually wasn't until incredibly recently, and I think you mentioned this, Mark, it wasn't until 1884 that Greenwich in London was chosen as the standard prime meridian. It still stands to this day. It was voted for by 26 countries. People finally figured out we have to have one. We're never going to solve this problem. So, okay, now they have a standard fixed prime meridian. Not that long ago, right? Like less than 200 years ago. It took a really long time. Still problems, because to accurately measure longitude, you also need to know the time. And this is where my quote in the beginning came from, talking about the importance of time. So basically, you have a 24-hour rotation of the Earth, right? One Earth day. It takes our Earth 24 hours to rotate around its axis. And this equates to about 15 degrees of longitude, movement per hour, which is about 1 degree of longitude every 4 minutes. So to figure this out, you need to know the time on board your ship and the local time at your port of departure or another known place, for instance, the prime meridian. And the difference in these times is then proportional to the angular distance between the ship and the reference location. And you can do the math. I can't tell you how to do the math, but you can do the math to then determine your longitude. So humans had figured out these are all the pieces of information we need. And if we had them, we could determine longitude. Problem: timepieces, clocks, watches, hourglasses couldn't be used at sea reliably. So changes in the magnetic pull of the Earth as you travel, because of the curvature of the Earth, extremes of heat and cold, the violent motion, extremes of humidity, all of this conspired to affect the speed, believe it or not, of timepieces on journeys. So the best minds of the 19th century were stumped, 18th and 19th century, when they're looking at this. Galileo, Mark's, favorite, he actually proposed an astronomical solution to determining longitude based on the moons of Jupiter. There was also a proposal based on using lunar distance, and then one based on variations in magnetic field, but none fully solved the problem, either because they didn't have all the pieces of the information.
And
like
the
they
planets
knew how to
move
solve
in a
it.
weird spiral in our sky. That
Exactly.
seems like that would really fuck things up.
And I think that's why Galileo
Sit
wanted
down, Galileo. What do you know?
do like the moons and not the planet. But then what if the moons were back? See, again, as Mark said, this topic is so rich.
I'm
that
still shamefully not processing. You mentioned, latitude's so easy because you're looking up, but I'm still awash in you're looking up, but why is that only latitude? Longitude, I mean, I get lost in the angles of where we are on a sphere. And I'm like, why the hell would that not be either one of them or somewhere in between?
And I don't know that I can give a good answer. If someone out there knows, please call and educate me, because I cannot tell you how much reading I've done over the past 2 weeks. And I still...
You know what I mean? I'm picturing you're somewhere on a golf ball, whatever, and you're looking up at one point in the distance.
Yeah.
That could be at any angle. You're not.
Right. But I think because with latitude, because the Earth is rotating, of course, I'm using my hands. Apologies to anyone not watching. Because the Earth is rotating around its axis, the latitudes stay relatively fixed, but the longitudes are constantly moving in time, and you're moving in time.
Because we're going around the sun at a tilt.
And our Earth is going around its axis, and the ship's traveling. So you could just travel straight along a latitude. It's always going to be your latitude, but a longitude is changing not only with your movement, but with the movement of the Earth, because it rotates in the same direction. So, ouch, I know.
Ouch. I love this.
So I'm going to stop. Okay. So
you said you need to know, and I still don't know why, but that's fine. I'll hack away at it for years. You need, if to be accurate, you'll figure out using a sextant or something your latitude. For your longitude, you need to know the time where you are and the time of your destination or your reference point.
Your reference point. So it was usually your port of departure or another kind of known place.
But and not then 3 points, just 2.
No, well, with that difference, it's right.
Okay.
I mean, someone could call in and be like, no, you're absolutely wrong.
No. Cool. No, there's no reason for me to ask that other than the trilateral thing that I was thinking of.
Right.
But
well, I think your third point is your latitude, and then you know the angles of the sun, and you're tying it together.
Yes,
I think,
sense, I think.
Yeah. So then you know where you are, right?
Cool. No, again, I'm embarrassed that
south.
before when I was talking about sitting on a map and I just said, picture you're on some grid. It's only now that I'm remembering, oh, right, Mark, that some grid is the Latin longitude degree system. I was using that as an example of like X and Y. Well, the X and Y, everybody I was talking about, is your Latin longitude.
It really is. And all of us learn about this in social studies when we're younger, in the US at least, but they don't really explain it, to be clear, or they didn't in my public high school or middle school.
Got it.
Okay. So
problem now, because I think you would need to know some of this stuff to do coding, like STEM stuff and coding for modern apps. Systems. You kind of need to know a lot of this.
Well, that's an interesting point. Okay, so astronomical solutions being proposed, but humans didn't have all the pieces of information they need. The time piece problem was huge. So the situation was so desperate that both Spain and Holland, Spain in the 16th century, Common Era, and Holland in the 17th century, the governments offered cash prizes for a solution. The French government in 1666 actually established the Royal Academy of Sciences specifically to tackle this issue. It was like the issue the world wanted to solve. Why? Why was this the big issue with everything else going on in the world, during the Renaissance? Well, for seafaring nations, much of their trade was reliant on ocean shipping. For some of these, naval military force and being able to wage their battles, Mark talked about. Maps had some pretty nefarious purposes as well. But without accurate navigation methods, even the best navigators couldn't accurately figure it out. I mean, they get close, but close, if you have a compilation of errors, could get you off by hundreds of miles, right? So they'd lose days or weeks or months, right, of time, which meant money, which we know drives a lot.
Right.
And in fact, whole ships were also lost because you misnavigate and you run into an island.
The Earth also isn't a perfect sphere, which I'm sure had to throw a wrench in the works somehow.
Okay. Right. Yeah, but we're not even going to go there.
Okay.
So you're losing money, and then there's a human life toll, right? People are dying. And so here's one prominent example of this. So it's called the Sobel incident. It happened in 1707. And there was Admiral Cloudesley Sobel, such a British name. And he had a fleet of English ships traveling north, 5 ships traveling north through the Atlantic Ocean from Gibraltar back to England, so towards the English Channel. And visibility was awful, really bad weather. So they couldn't use the stars or the sun. So the crew, the navigator, calculated their position using dead reckoning. Dead reckoning, I feel like, I've heard that phrase my whole life and I don't know what it means. So what it means is the practice of using your past position or a past position to estimate your current position. You did this based on, the speed you're traveling and, the direction you're traveling, because you either have a compass or, ideally you have astronomical bodies, but, they might not have. And the length of time that you've been on a particular course, give or take, because as I said, timepieces at sea were notoriously, but you could get an estimate. So dead reckoning wasn't the most reliable because, like I said, those errors accumulated, but you could use it to kind of get quote unquote close. Well, Sobel's navigators incorrectly estimated their position using dead reckoning by about 50 miles, a lot, right? If you're out at sea. And because of this, 4 of those 5 ships crashed directly onto the rocks of the Scilly Islands. I'd never heard of these, Scilly, and sank, resulting in, estimates vary, but probably the deaths of about 2,000 men. And the murder of Admiral Sobel, I'm laughing not because of murder, but because I'm going to tell you, he was murdered by a local woman after he washed ashore. He was actually still alive, unlike most of the others, when he washed ashore. And a local woman saw his emerald ring and murdered him to take it. She figured she didn't admit this till she was on her deathbed, I think in her 80s. That's how they know. So I was just thinking, karma, and I'll tell you why. Shout out to our payment episode when we talked about karma. He had just executed a crew member before this disaster. Why? because a crew member dared to aver that the reckoning the navigators had done was wrong. And he'd been keeping his own books. This was illegal. As a crew member, you were not allowed to do this. Like only the navigator, top secret information. This doesn't quite make sense to me. And I didn't do all the research because again, then we wouldn't be doing this episode because I'd still be reading. And it was considered mutiny, literally for a crew member to keep like a log of locations. Clearly this young man was just good at this and trying to learn where he said they were. And because it was in the log that they recovered, and it was considered mutiny, and Sobel executed him on the spot and continued on, and shortly after died along with 2,000 of his men. So karma. Okay. So the Sobel incident.
And like gladly an example of how well-functioning teams nowadays, the culture is, sorry to bring very like a corporate modern sort of organizational behavior type of approach to it. But that's why the best managers, you are managing people that often know technically more than you in a lot of different ways. And you welcome that. You're not supposed to, you're a leader to bring the best out of a lot of different people. And as a group, you move forward in the best way. To have this rigid, bizarre, it's pecking order, ridiculous, and clearly doesn't serve you.
Right.
How amazing would it have been to actually look at and welcome that thought while they're
still
before
alive?
they hit the rocks. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think that rigid structure in the British military is part of the reason the British lost the Revolutionary War in the States, because they were still fighting in like rigid formation, for instance. And there was such a hierarchy. Okay. So there you go. This incident to this day is still one of the worst shipwrecks in British history. And it was so bad at the time that it precipitated the passage of what is called the Longitude Act of 1714. So the British government offered the largest monetary
Damn, we
prize
cover some sexy
yet.
topics on this show.
Right? For a solution to the problem of longitude. They offered 20,000 pounds. That's millions of dollars in today's currency. I mean, that was like an insane amount of money. That is how bad this problem was. So at this point, okay, everyone understands the relationship between time and longitude, as I mentioned, but they still can't solve it. Sir Isaac Newton, who was still alive at the time, couldn't figure it out. I mean, he had some astronomical theories, but he couldn't figure it out. That's how hard it is. Okay, so along comes a man named John Harrison.
He had to have a ship bonk him on the head, and then he would have been like, oh, okay.
Wow. That was like a stretch. That was a stretch.
Yeah.
So along comes John Harrison. He was born in Yorkshire in 1693. He was a carpenter. His stepfather was a carpenter. And in 1713, before he is even 20 years old, he completes building his first pendulum clock. He had no training in watchmaking or repair. There were no active clockmakers that even lived in his rural area at the time, according to records we have of occupations. Clocks and watches would have been financially out of his family's reach. So it is a complete mystery as to how this young man, obviously he just had, an engineer's brain.
It was the aliens.
How he did this. It could have been. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about his journey, and anyone who knows the story is going to realize that I am leaving a lot out. And the reason I'm leaving a lot out is because we would be here for hours. So I'm going to give you the highlights, and it's probably going to leave you with a lot of questions, but it will give you some interesting information as well. So we'll do this relatively quickly. So over those next 2 years after he built his first clock, he built a couple more, and they were extraordinary. So in one of them, he used wood. He used both oak for its strength and a type of hardwood called lignum vitae, which kind of self-lubricates, like it creates an oil, so that no lubrication was required. Oils get like kludgy. I don't think that's an actual word, but at sea. So this matters later, right? For metals, in one of those clocks, he only used brass, which solved the rust problem. So all these things that timepieces face, like he just thought of and solved. By 1720-ish, he already has a reputation as like, hey, this kid makes amazing timepieces. In the second of those, he did his first clock, then he did two more. In the second of those, he combined different metals. He took brass and then steel, and he interlaced them. And he did this to negate the speeding up and slowing down of timepieces. So when temperature changed at the time, metals, of course, expand or contract based on heat or cold, and this would affect the working of the mechanism, and your watch, your timepiece would slow down or speed up. This is ringing some
bizarre bell from something I read a million years ago, right? Yeah,
that's so
they had to
interesting.
be fused together, right? So that they, got it.
Yep, they were like, and he did like an interlace, like a grid. Hilariously, a grid. Grid seems to be the answer to everything. So known watches of the day, timepieces made by master clock makers drifted by up to a minute per day. His 1 second max. I mean, that is how brilliant he was. So by 1727, he has his eye on this Longitude prize. Again, it's a mystery. There's no documentation on how he learned about it. He lived out in the middle of nowhere in Yorkshire. I mean, sure, there were probably town criers and newspapers, and there was a port like near enough that they probably got the news. But he kind of was like, I think I can do this. He'd already figured out the lubricant issue, the rust-free construction, a pendulum mechanism with 2 different metals that I talked about. He still had to solve like salt corrosion, ocean, like violent ocean motion. But he thinks he's got it sorted. And so in 1730, he heads to London. He wants to pitch his design idea to the Longitude Committee. At this point, it is 16 years after the passage of the Longitude Act. Not one idea has been heard by a majority of the board. So many proposals have been made, and they were all ridiculous. Like, honestly, I wish we had time. I would tell you some of them, or just so incomplete that they weren't valid. So he met with astronomer Edmund Halley of Halley's Comet fame. So at that time, Edmund Halley was the astronomer royal, right? He was the head astronomer in England. I don't know, and I couldn't find how he got an audience with Halley. Halley was on the Longitude board, but I don't know how he got in to see him. But Halley saw enough merit in the design that he referred Harrison to a renowned clockmaker named George Graham. And after one day of discussion, Graham became Harrison's patron. He looked at the design and said, "You're a genius. I will be your patron." And over the next 5 years, Harrison worked on developing, and he did create his first, what they called then a C clock, and he nicknamed it H1, right? Harrison 1. He had a trial run to Portugal. The act, there were all these stipulations in the act to win the money. You had to, right, meet all these things. The act mandated that the piece had to run to the West Indies and back. So this little Portugal trial run ended up not counting, but the piece worked great. It only erred by a few seconds. It was really big. It was a very large piece. Harrison was a perfectionist. He wanted to improve it. So they're like, "This is great. We should do a West Indies run." He said, "You know what? Let me make an H2. Because I want to make it smaller and I want to make some improvements." So he makes H2, but this can't be tested because Britain was at war. So in the meantime, he comes up with H3. This is almost 20 years later. This man was an insane perfectionist.
So it's been about 36 years since the passage of the law then.
And things still have not been solved, right? So at the same time as he's working on this, astronomers and scientists were trying to work out, I mentioned briefly earlier, the lunar distance method, which I'm not going to go into detail on because, again, we don't have time. But they thought this was much more sound. It was based on like principles of science, right? And physics and mathematics. They hated Harrison's ideas. And they felt like if Harrison's ideas worked, if you could use a timepiece, if there was a timepiece that could be trusted at sea, anyone could use it without being a man of science. And God forbid we create something that anyone can use without having to be like a brilliant, physicist. Just really, there was a lot of nastiness going on at the time and a lot of undercutting. Okay, so that's happening at the same time. He's getting a lot of resistance from them. He's trying to make this perfect thing. And then they do a run of H3. And again, it's like good, not perfect. And at the same time as well, there were other watchmaking improvements made by others. So a man named Thomas Mudge, who was Graham's protege and then successor, he kind of had ended up, probably because the creation of improvements in steel, he was able to make some land timepieces that were much more accurate than previous ones. And so Harrison was thinking, okay, things have progressed so much, I can use some of this now, right? So a lot of just like updates going on. He redesigns the concept. And in 1759, finally, 45 years after the passage of the Longitude Act, H4 goes on a run to the West Indies, meets all the requirements of the act. I mean, it is just absolutely what they need. But the Longitude Board calls for 3 mathematicians to corroborate the findings. Now, I guess that's fair enough, right? Because you have to calculate the longitude, latitude.
I'm still waiting for this dude to get screwed out of the reward somehow.
Nah. So they also claim that in one stop, which was Jamaica, the crew hadn't accurately confirmed the longitude for Jamaica. I mean, it was honestly, it seems very much like a ploy to just not, like you said, have to pay the prize money, get the technology. So the board finally says, fine. You can have like some of the prize if you hand over all the clocks, H1 through 3 at that point, I think, and teach us about the mechanisms and how everything works. And you have to create 2 more, which is not a stipulation in the act, right? So they are just totally trying to get all this for nothing.
Trying to picture what the patent law situation was at the time.
And there was patent law because some of the other things, but yeah. So he's not happy, but he finally just like, what am I going to do, right? So he finally tells all, gives them the clocks. Astronomers are still fighting him. In 1764, 5 years after that first H4 run, they do a second run, right? Okay, like let's prove this once and for all. More math checking follows. Final report, accurate longitude readings within 10 miles. This is 3 times more accurate than the act stipulated it needed to be. It is astounding, this feat. But during this trial run, Halley had passed away, and there was a new astronomer royal named Neville Maskelyne. And he was just nasty. He believed the only way to do this was with the lunar distance method. He went through every kind of, method to try to discredit Harrison. And he was asked by the board to go on that second trial run. So he is there monitoring this and to test his lunar distance system. Once again, the watch proves like incredibly accurate, absolutely amazing, beats all the projections. His lunar distance measures were also fairly good. They weren't as good. They weren't as accurate. And they also require like considerable work and calculation, unlike the timepiece, and you plug it into an equation. So at a meeting at the Longitude Board in 1765, the results are presented, but they say, you know what? The accuracy of the measurements was probably just luck. Like, again, anyone not watching, Mark's just rolling his eyes at how awful this was for Harrison. So it gets like escalated.
40-something years into this. It's just
exactly. And while they've paid him some money, he's had to use that money for supplies and like to keep building. And he still continues to build, but they took all his former clocks, so he doesn't have like them for reference. It's a nightmare. So the matter actually ends up reaching Parliament because I think Harrison does make a bit of a stink. And they're like, hey, you can have a 10,000 pound advance. And then you can have the rest of the prize money once, you again, like continue to do this, turn over all the designs, etc. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to skip through some of this in the interest of time. So we know that Maskelyne is nasty. He's so 1765. He was born in 1693, so he's old. So we know that Neil Maskelyne is pretty nasty, and he's the Astronomer Royal. He comes back from Barbados from that second run, and he's actually placed on the Board of Longitude now. So now Harrison has no chance, right? He returns a report that the watch, negatively speaking about the watch. And he just, because he wanted the lunar distance method. So the first marine watch of Harrison's fails to meet the needs of the board, except it passed every trial. So Harrison begins working on H5 while the board takes H4 and tries to do some tests on land. So Harrison obviously feels like he's being held hostage by the board. And after 3 years more, he's had enough. Finally, I can't believe he lasted that long. He felt, quote, extremely ill-used by the gentleman who I might have expected better treatment from. And he decides to go directly to King George III. I mean, when he's done, I guess. And he says, I'm going to go talk to King George. And he obtains an audience, and the king tests the watch himself. And I think he tested,
Did he eat it? I'm just kidding. Isn't this the crazy king? Isn't George III bit insane?
Was it third?
I thought so.
Anyway, he is absolutely convinced.
I don't remember. Anyway,
we'll Google it. So he tests it, and after 10 weeks of daily observations, he finds it to be accurate to within 1/3 of 1 second per day. So the king is pissed. He's like, they need to get, yes, this, you are right. And so he tells Harrison, petition Parliament for the full prize, right? And if I will threaten them, like I will threaten to appear in person and like be nasty to them if they don't give this to you. So finally, in 1773, when he was 80 years old, Harrison received the rest of the monetary award. Remember, he's been getting bits of money, but unfortunately he had to spend most of it to keep developing out of his own pocket. But he gets, the rest of the monetary award, but he gets a further amount. He never received the official award, never awarded to anybody, by the way. And he only survived for just 3 more years after that. So he worked himself to death. He solved one of the biggest problems. So in total, I think he received around the amount of the prize, but again, most of it was spent then trying to create the next level. So the end of his life, at least he becomes the equivalent of a multimillionaire for the last, few years. But bottom line, now he had a lot of help on those last versions because of some of those other clockmakers I mentioned. So there were all these other advances and he worked with them. Like Mark was talking about good leadership. He didn't say, oh, crap, you're doing really good stuff I didn't think of. He said, great, come help me. And they did. Right. And so it's not on him alone, but it's mostly on him. But finally, to this day, the
difference between politics and to like a scientific community, which is working on furthering knowledge usually, right? There's yeah. Business and politics different than like the scientific community being like band together to further the science. It's great. Cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So to this day, the sea clocks, which became known as chronometers are standard issue on all ships. And that is because George Harrison, this little man who came out of nowhere, like did all this work to make it happen. And he was just kind of a quiet genius. He had this massive mental capability without like a formal education. And so I just think it's a really frustrating story, right? But it's like really like hooray for John Harrison and humans, that capability humans have to put their minds to like really, really large problems. And also like boo to the mean-spirited, greedy, egotistical board and government and astronomers.
So you're saying there's still... That makes sense. They're still required, I'm assuming, because this is all analog stuff. So in case our, digital systems and probably, I'm assuming, I don't know anything about modern timepieces, but like atomic clocks, things are like insanely accurate now. If all of that gets blasted by, I don't know, an EMP or something.
They have to have this. And I believe that like even navigators today need to understand, like, right to your point, like how to do this in case they needed to, like if the equipment went down. So
the equivalent of terrain, survival training, it's naval survival training with like, oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, which is perfect. So basically this tale, and again, I apologize, there's so much left out, so it might have been very confusing, but hopefully they got the gist across. But
that's great.
It's kind of this tale of like trying to solve one of the thorniest scientific issues of history. Really shows us the best and the worst of human nature. You got Harrison and his clockmakers working together on one side and Haley really supporting him, even though he's an astronomer. And then you have all the nasties really just trying to screw him at every turn. So that is it. That is my dive into the
Thank you. No, that was fantastic. And literally the background and the detail and the color you gave it really feels like, I think I said this about one of your recent rabbit holes, actually, really should be like a Netflix special, like this big epic story of, the things that are on the line are literally solving a massive problem that is the foundation of so much of human progress, and et cetera, et cetera.
And interestingly, you said that I did find it was a BBC 2-part TV movie from late 90s, early 2000s. I haven't watched it because I didn't have time, but I am going to watch it. But it has Jeremy Irons in it.
Playing
no, he's not playing. He's playing a future like clockmaker who gets obsessed with Harrison and how he never kind of got his due. You can now go see his clocks at the Horological Museum in London, and you can also like go to his birthplace and all that. But I am going to watch that. So once upon a time, somebody did it. There you go, Mark.
Excellent. Well done. Very well done. That's great.
What is your big question?
Yeah, I think in the interest of time with our episode, let's we'll go through our questions and get our new noun for next time. So mine, I basically jotted down. I feel like I always get one, and then there's like three related questions right after it. So this is sort of a little bundle of questions. Do maps intrinsically reinforce difference rather than unity? Has the human act of delineating here from there, time and again, significantly contributed to human suffering by binding together the familiar and pitting it against the other or the unknown? Will there ever, right? Am I making sense? So instead of just purely delineating, there is a tree there, then there's a river here, it becomes a nation of, well, our tribe or our nation's boundary ends at the river, and then the people that are across the river become, because it's forced into a map understanding, X our section. Does that, you know what I mean? We're constantly building little boxes, and I realize that the basis of human understanding is usually in contrast. We need something to be an opposite of something else. It might just be how we understand things, but that's kind of where my philosophical question meandered. And then it ends with, will there ever come a time when humanity uses maps only to understand geography and not to define other nations? That brings up big questions around a one world order versus the moment that we may have contact with alien organizations and we are communities and cultures that would suddenly bind the earth together in a way that would very much change the way we look at a map. It might change the way we right now view France versus the US. And then, yes, of course, we have maps for like the states and it gets down to our counties and everything else. But I feel like suddenly something that is another other like that would change the way we look at a global map. That's where I went.
I love that. No, I was thinking the same thing. Actually, I didn't write it as my big question, but I was going to write something very similar. I have a hard time envisioning the day when maps are only used for good, to be honest. Unfortunately, I agree with you. You're never going to see humanity so united as when the aliens attack.
Seriously.
If the aliens attack, right? But one of the like roots, I considered going with this was talking about the evil, not the evil of maps. The maps aren't inherently evil. It's the governments that are commissioning the maps and then trying to shift the borders. And I didn't want to do a downer. I wanted to do like the inspiration of John Harrison instead. So I don't think we are going to get there, but I'm going to tack my question onto yours and then get your answer to both and have you talk more about yours because I think they're related because I was going in that direction. And also it's kind of two parts. It was something you mentioned earlier. So we're so reliant, as you said, on GPS these days instead of compasses or map reading. Forget longitude, latitude reckoning. That's way out the window. And because we all have the GPSs. So my question was, and you kind of talked about this earlier, should these skills still continue to be taught in public schools? Because there is a chance that people are going to need them. Or is it less important because GPS like gives us such a greater good? I think you briefly like sideswiped this earlier, like for instance, instead of just like maps so we can look at so we can figure out what to conquer next, there are people using maps for really good causes like crisis mapping. It's like when the earthquake hit Haiti, this random guy like set up like a map, took in calls and Twitter things and started using a map that to the point where FEMA called him after 2 days and was like, can we use this to help people and to get aid? And it's been used in disaster after disaster now. And it's like a really beautiful use for a real-time map where volunteers just come in to like plot the information, to take the information and to help translate. So there you go. Just a big, wide question. Is the GPS giving us enough good or should we still be learning about the other stuff as well?
I feel like it's so related to, we've talked a bit in some other episodes around if suddenly massive nuclear warfare wipes out our ability to use computers, will we have access and how much information and knowledge will we really have if suddenly we are such a connected social web of surgeons know how to do surgery and the different it's like siloed approaches. People specialize in professions. We don't really have somebody that can do it all. So if we suddenly were reduced to very small communities rather than a nation that is connected through highways and information systems that we can talk instantly across platforms like Zoom that we're using right now to record this or whatever. I guess what I'm saying is if we were disconnected from each other and suddenly it was a small compound of 50 people and your survival relied on the knowledge base of those 50 people, right? And then those 50 people started to repopulate an area. Yeah, you're going to lose. It's not just location data. It's like so much, but I guess how we would solve it is similar. How do we maintain access to it or have at least a sample size of people in society know enough about it as a safety net? Or is that really being over prepared? Because couldn't we say that about everything throughout history? However, sorry to just go down there. However, we've never been at a place where analog physical things necessarily would have completely disappeared. Wait, let me think about that. No, we have, because we've had things burn. Was it the library at Alexandria and things like that?
Yeah.
I don't know. So maybe it's just the same pattern cycle we need to figure out is how much at risk are we of being totally left up the creek without a paddle, right? Because we were using a digital paddle and now we can't. Or just something like that. You know what I mean? I don't know. That's really hard. I guess that's why they're the big questions.
Yeah. Again, it's one of those questions probably where the answer is like both. Like GPS isn't just used for evil. It is used for good as well. Like, for instance, crisis mapping. Also, we should probably teach kids some basics. In fact, I was thinking maybe I need to take like a, orienteering course to just be better.
Yeah. It's funny, at the same time, anyone who hasn't been following what Apple has been including in their iOS as they release new devices, one of the major advancements in personal safety and so on for hikers that really go out beyond where you would have towers and things like that is the satellite linking. I don't know if you know about this, Alison.
I don't know.
So now it's called a SOS capability on devices. If you're really, really out in rural areas and an emergency happens or something like that, and you don't have any bars, or you don't have coverage, you can use the SOS and it will guide you to basically find and have to, like, I'm going to butcher the details, but point and align your device to a passing satellite until it links and sends an emergency beacon, basically. So it's a fascinating way that, therefore, that's kind of like open. You don't need to have freight coverage. It's not on what we're used to. You have no signal otherwise, but you're able to at least have a lifeline, a tether to literally amazing. A passing satellite.
Yeah, satellite. That is really, really cool.
Anyway, I feel like that's related just because it's right. It's
no, it is. It's another good.
It's another good thing. Like tech fallback safety net. Yeah. Anyway,
I love it.
All
right. Well, I'll put this in the notes and on the website, of course, but I read a book about Harrison, which is why it was so hard for me to like really squeeze it down. But it's called Longitude, the true story of a lone genius who solved the greatest scientific problem of his time. And I highly, highly recommend it if you want to know more, because I know I left you with a lot of questions and probably a lot of confusion.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, we'll have that in the notes for sure.
So, Mark, you want to revisit your rating?
Yeah, I was just looking. So I had given this a 7 when we got map. And I think I'm going to just drop a little bit to a 6.
All right. Mark is at a 6. So I was at an 8, and I'm actually going to drop to a 6.5.
Oh,
and
okay.
I'll tell you why. I learned so much, and Harrison was this amazing, amazing story. But this one was so hard because, again, as Mark mentioned in the beginning, and I've repeated about 100 times, it's such a rich area. You could go in about 100 different directions at least. And I had a really hard time trying to like narrow it down. And then I had a really hard time trying to understand like the physics and the math. And so my brain hurt. So it was like interesting, but it was harder than some of the other ones. So I'm combining those two things and just dropping it to a 6.5.
Excellent. All right. Well, should I give us our new word?
Yes, please.
Okay, everyone.
Woo.
So for next episode, Alison and I will be researching the noun appendix.
Oh, all right. Appendix. APPENDIX.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I don't know. Go
Appendix. Okay. I am going to give it a 6.
Okay. A 6 for you. I don't know. Like, yeah, we call this the gut reaction. I'm gonna give it a 3.
Oh, wow. Really
I don't know.
low.
I just am sort of like, I don't know. I would have to be very surprised that if it's, for me, it's probably, it's always the slide that I make at the end of my PowerPoint presentation to throw the crap in that we don't maybe cover. Maybe I'll find something in the etymology, like sometimes, as I always do, to hook into. But I can't imagine this is going to be very interesting, but we'll see.
I feel like it maybe has some potential. All right. Well, do you want to read us out, Mark?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, so much. This has been another episode of the ReNouned podcast. So what we would love if you could, on whatever platform you are listening to us on, give us a follow and also a rating. We would love that feedback. Good ratings for us also help us spread the word and build our audience. You can also find us on the web at renounedpodcast.com. Check out blog posts, some information, a little bit more of the works cited if you want to geek out some more and read some of the sources of information that Alison and I are pulling from. You can also please follow us on Instagram at ReNouned Podcast, and we'd love the follow there. We'd love some interaction. You can, post, comment, share some things, DM us, whatever you'd like to do to engage with the show would be fantastic. And so we thank you very much as always, and we will talk to you next time when we talk about appendix. We'll see how that goes.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.